from the historic point of view and what is going on today through the prism of the Charter of the United Nations that is ratified by all the countries present here that you represent today. It provides for universal principles that are intended to govern interstate relations. These principles include a sovereign equality of states, refraining from the threat to use of force, and respect for the human rights without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. As I have said already, all member states of the United Nations have subscribed to these and other principles. However, our Western colleagues to better understand the geopolitical situation, where we should call them the Western minority, they simply ignore these principles, like a sovereign equality of states was never observed by the Western countries, and they have always ignored it. Since the establishment of the United Nations, you would probably remember world crises happening around the world, and in this situation the West have never respected the principle of a sovereign equality of states. They thought that they are better than others. That's the phrase that you know, golden billion, and that's the phrase that was used by Joseph Borrell, that the European Union is surrounded by jungles, so by the countries, again, that we represent today. And you probably remember the phrase made by Blinken, former State Secretary of the United States, who said that those who are not going to have a seat at the democratic table will be served on the menu. This is the philosophy, their philosophy with regard to the sovereign equality of states. But if the West is making references to these principles, they just justify their actions and they pick out principles in a selective way, and they choose the principles that are beneficial to them in this or another situation. If we remember the situation in Kosovo, they said that they use the principle of self-determination of peoples without holding any referendum when they unilaterally proclaimed their independence, and when the situation in Crimea happened, when more than 90% of Crimeans voted for Crimean accession to Russia, and they have did that openly and transparently, the West said that the principle of territorial integrity should be observed. We are well aware of their principles and actions. The nationalists who rose to power in Kiev in 2014 as a result of an armed anti-constitutional coup, they rose to power as a result of violating another principle of the Charter of the United Nations, which is the non-interference in domestic affairs of other states. This coup d'etat was organized and orchestrated by the United States. It was not even hidden by the officials of the previous U.S. administration, like Victoria Nuland, when she proudly stated in the Senate that they are happy that the United States have spent $5 billion on organizing the coup d'etat in Ukraine. It was done the next day after signing an agreement between the opposition and then former president of Ukraine. All the guarantees that were given in this agreement were made null and void by European countries. After legitimate authorities were ousted, the new authorities have launched a real carnage against people of the southeastern part of Ukraine who disagreed with their policy. They used artillery and combat aviation. The package of measures for the implementation of Minsk Agreements was intended to stop these hostilities that lasted for a year and that should serve as a basis for the peaceful settlement of the conflict. And this package of measures was approved by the UN Security Council Resolution 2202. However, as European countries admitted, Kiev and its Western handlers in Berlin and Paris were not going to implement this document, and from the very beginning they were ready to sabotage its implementation. They used it as a smokescreen in order to buy time and to increase the war capabilities of the Kiev regime. Therefore, it constitutes a gross violation of the Article 25 of the Charter of the United Nations, stipulating that all member states should accept the decision of the Security Council. But again, the West shows total disregard for these provisions, like they have been ignoring other principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and its resolutions, like a resolution on the need to establish a state of Palestine. In March 2014, residents of Crimea, and in September 2022, residents of the Donetsk People's Republic, Lugansk People's Republic, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions voted in referendum, and they exercised their right of self-determination that is enshrined in Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations. The Russian Federation has recognized them, taking into account the aggression that is being carried out by the Kiev regime and supported by the Western countries, and we protected them in line with the Article 51, which provides a right for states to exercise the right for collective or individual self-defense. But again, the West didn't want to pay their attention to provisions of this article, and they continued to maintain that Russia has violated the territorial integrity of Ukraine. That's why this territorial integrity should be recovered. They deliberately ignore the interpretation of the Charter of the United Nations because years of negotiations were spent to interpret the Charter of the United Nations, and this process was complete in 1970 when the General Assembly adopted by consensus the Declaration on Principles of International Law. Speaking about territorial integrity, it should be taken into account that an opinion, a single and uniform opinion of the international community should be taken into account. This document, the Declaration on Principles of International Law of 1970, confirms the inviolability of territorial integrity and political unity of only those states that comply with the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples and that possess of a government representing the whole people belonging to their territory without distinction as to race, creed, or color. It is obvious that the Kiev regime that sent to Crimea so-called trains of friendship with armed soldiers, and later they shelled Donbass when they burned people alive in Odessa, when they conducted ethnic cleansing campaigns. They didn't represent people belonging to their territories. And those who signed and didn't implement the Minsk Agreements, I mean Ukrainian figures of that period of time, they called people living in Crimea and Donbass as non-humans. They told that their children will rot in the underground, in cellars, when it was actually said by the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, and Zelensky himself. He said it in September 2021, long before the special military operation was launched, when he answered the question in the interview, the question what he thinks about people who refused to accept the results of coup d'etat and who should be granted autonomy according to the Minsk Agreements. He stated, there are people and there are beings, creatures. And if someone lives on the territory of Ukraine and they think that they are related to the Russian culture and to the Russian language, for the sake of their future, for the sake of their children, they should go to Russia and leave Ukraine. How can this political regime, whose leaders say such things, represent a population that they are talking about, and yet they claim that Donbass is part of Ukraine? All of that is a violation of the declaration adopted in 1970. It should be also stated that Ukraine has legalized a ban on the use of Russian language in education, mass culture, in everyday communication. If you go to a shop in Ukraine and if you'll speak Russian, they will refuse to serve you and they will call the police even. A canonical Russian Orthodox Church is banned in Ukraine. And as I've told you in the beginning of my remarks, the Charter of the United Nations requires to respect human rights without distinction as to race, sex, religion, and language. Ukraine is an only country that banned the use of a foreign language. There is no country in the world that would ban any foreign language. And the Palestinian territories in other Arab countries, Hebrew is not banned, and Arabic language is not banned in Israel. So you should make conclusions how it aligns with the requirement to observe the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. There is also another article of the Charter of the United Nations, which is Article 100, which requires the UN staff to stay impartial and act in interests of all states, of all member states. Unfortunately, today we see gross violation of this article. UN staff and staff of the Secretariat that represent the Western states express anti-Russian statements, and they stick to the anti-Russian line, and they make references to the resolutions that were adopted by the so-called emergency special sessions, and 8 resolutions were adopted by this emergency special session. A third or a fourth of countries refused to vote for this resolution, but yet the Secretariat believes that this resolution exists and it needs to be implemented. When I asked Mr. Guterres, does these resolutions include a declaration that I mentioned earlier that requires to respect the principle of self-determination of peoples, Mr. Guterres refused to reply, and his team continues to request the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis in line with the principles of the UN Charter and with respect to the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So the Chief of the United Nations does not observe the main provisions of the Charter, and the general tone is set by him with regard to the anti-Russian policy. Recently, Antonio Guterres has condemned the Russian attack on Ukrainian cities every time when Ukraine and its western hosts are organizing hysteria and accuse Russia of attacking civil infrastructure. We see that the Secretariat of the United Nations supports their statements and claims, and together they require to punish Russia. The Russian armed forces has never attacked civil infrastructure. To each accusation, we asked a question: where is your evidence? Where are the facts? We need them, evidence and facts. And as for fake news in which the Russian army is accused of crimes that were in reality committed by the Ukrainian regimes, we have so many facts. We even have a special video that we will show you if the situation will allow it. But the violations and crimes committed by the Kiev regime are so evident, we have so many facts about it, but yet the UN Secretariat takes a contrary position on that, and they are trying to whitewash the actions of the Kiev regime. In particular, they turn a blind eye to the violations of the international humanitarian law, like a ban on stationing military hardware and firing positions in residential areas, torture and harassment of prisoners of war and civilians. When it is impossible to deny a gross violation of international law, then the UN Secretariat makes calls to exercise restraint. When they make these calls to both sides of the conflict, we have noticed a similar reaction when it was clear to everyone what inhumane actions are being taken by the Kiev neo-Nazi units when they invaded Kursk region. They deliberately attacked shops, schools, and other facilities of the civil infrastructure. They have abducted civilians and took them as hostages. The Kiev, it was also confirmed that the Kiev regime is violating the international law, and the example is what happened in Bucha in 2022. More than 3 years passed after the Kiev regime and its Western handlers have quickly invented a far-fetched story about mass killings of locals by the Russian soldiers. They have introduced new sanctions against our country. I have made numerous calls to Antonio Guterres and to the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I requested their assistance in acquiring all the necessary information about the investigation of a case that is being served by the West as a tragedy. We have sent several official inquiries to Volker Turk, to the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In September 24 was the last time we sent a request, and the reply we received only in July, so we waited for a reply for almost a year.
It contains quite a very interesting information. According to this response, the High Commissioner on Human Rights, Secretariat, analyzed our request and came to a conclusion that this information cannot be disclosed because it would be in violation of obligations on confidentiality before the third persons and parties, and could jeopardize the activities of the United Nations. If you understood something from this response, then I'm quite envious of you, because no one, it indicates that Secretariat is not willing to bring to the justice those who are responsible for these bloody provocations and stagings. And as far as Secretary Guterres is concerned, I have been asking him for 3 years. You are not capable of investigating into this crisis, but can you use your authority just to get the list of those deaths who were depicted on TV in the streets of Bucha, and they just demonstrated these dead bodies just in the presence of luckily present BBC journalist. I asked Mr. Guterres, and he is quite shy to respond to these questions. I believe this is just not a good thing for the Secretariat headed by Mr. Guterres. Just recently, Mr. Guterres has made another statement. He just said that he is not expecting the quick settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. It should be ceasefire, but it should be done on the basis of the UN Charter and norms of General Assembly and international law. I was referring to these principles of the General Assembly and principles ignored by Mr. Guterres, and only one principle, which is the respect for Ukrainian sovereignty, territorial integrity, should be observed, which means the support for the Ukrainian side and withdrawal of the Russian troops from the lands, the population of which voted against the presence of these territories within Ukraine. We are not talking about territories, we are talking about the fates of those people whose ancestors built factories, developed and cultivated these lands, and now the regime which came to power through coup d'etat is referring to as inhumans. And after the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, Zelensky rejected any idea of ceasefire and settlement to this crisis. It turns out for him that everything started from the Russian invasion to Ukraine. And the earlier coup d'etat in 2014, war against its own people, and Minsk Agreements, which were intended to stop this war, which Ukrainian and Kiev regime failed to do, and which required to provide the special status for the territories, the part of the southeast of Ukraine, which was approved by the United Nations. For 7 years, no one implemented this, and when in February 2022, Russia, after repeated attempts to make an agreement on sabotaging the Minsk Agreements and war against their own people, Ukrainian people, and reaching the mutually acceptable conditions, we were made take into account the numerous calls. Then all after these events, Mr. Guterres noted this, saying that Russian intervention and invasion in Ukraine. So he stated that Russia insisted and rejected the peace accords and insisted on continuing the war. Yes, we had the ceasefire, an agreement on a settlement initially, so that in 2014, with the intention to set up the governments of uniting all peoples, and Germany and France were guarantors of this agreement. Then it was brushed away. Then all this was followed by Minsk Agreement with ceasefire, settlement, peaceful settlement, and principles of the global settlement. Everything was stumped. So Mr. Guterres, of course, is inclined to follow the Western attitude to reject historic events. The West always turn to the history just to justify their actions when it meets its own interests. So there was any coup d'etat in Ukraine, Russia just recognized the Crimea as its territory in response to the appeals from the Crimean population. So there are a lot of examples to that. So it's pity to see when the heads of the Secretariat just follow the anti-Russian front while putting in jeopardy and in detriment to its authority. And we see for many years the West has sought to monopolize the key positions in the Secretariat of the United Nations. So from 5 to 6 high positions, starting from Secretary, its deputies responsible for peacekeeping operations, peace settlement, humanitarian actions and problems, security issues, and issues related to UN reforming on the eve of 80th anniversary. So all these positions are taken by the representatives of the West. The first deputy of the Secretary General, the representative of Nigeria, but at the same time, she is a citizen of the United States. So it's up to you to make any conclusions. Of course, we will be seeking to stop this practice when the Western countries just manage to obtain all the leverage of the management of the United Nations, and we will seek to return the situation when the United Nations is a common platform for the search of the balanced resolutions. Recently we saw the intensification of the efforts to settle the Ukrainian situation, crisis, and we welcome the steps of our friends from China, from Brazil, and from Asian and African countries, and the friends of peace in Ukraine group. We welcome the initiatives of the African countries headed by the South Africa, and there are another steps and attempts by the Arab States League as well, and we see that new U.S. administration also realizes the need of settling the crisis through recognizing the root causes of this crisis and through elimination of these root causes. On August 15, there was a meeting in Alaska between the presidents of Russia and the United States. There was a clear understanding by the U.S. administration of the need to get rid of these root causes, and President Trump publicly talked about this. He was the only one from the Western leaders saying that inviting Ukraine into NATO was a mistake, which was one of the root causes of this crisis. And the US side realizes that people objecting and rejecting the oppression voted for returning to Russia and claiming that they will never be living under the rule of Kiev regime. And this understanding was reflected in those initiatives put forward by the Trump's administration, and the whole number of its representatives made public statements on that. So once again, we are not talking about territories. So some concessions sought by Russia. We are not talking about territories. We are talking about the fates of people who are not considered by the Kiev regime as human beings, and they are seeking to eliminate them physically and from a legal point of view. In the same manner, the U.S. administration understands that the violation of human rights, linguistic rights, is not acceptable, and we also discussed the blatant action by Kiev regime to ban the canonic Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And at the same time, we see that Kiev regime is trying to undermine these actions by the U.S. administration. Mr. Zelensky made some statements claiming if we manage to preserve our statehood, not even in those borders, that would be regarded as a victory, because Russia is seeking to eliminate us. So the main idea is that he realizes that it's not possible to come back to what was before the crisis. But recently, speaking at an international conference, he said that he will never agree to give a part of the Ukrainian land to Putin. So some could imagine that we are talking about the exchange of territories for the sake of restoring our relations with the United States. It's not so. The main idea is just to keep Russia isolated and use its finances frozen abroad for the military support of Ukraine. So, in fact, he wants to prevent the good-thinking forces in the Western countries to follow these sound courses. He also referred to China. He said that there was a need to motivate China to go along the non-military way. So he's trying to have some conflict between Western countries and China, like some adventurers. This is the behavior of adventurers, and we are always blamed for not willing to have peace agreements. We had them 3 years ago, but we were blatantly deceived without any remorses, and now they are claiming the same. Mr. Schmigel, the former Prime Minister, answering several days ago the questions on the conditions of peace negotiations, he said that there were not any conditions. We need to have all possible weapons in order to continue fighting. So this is the attitude of these people to their own slogans and calls. So in general, in fact, we observe that Kiev regime is oriented by the behaviors of the party of war, and in Europe we see also the supporters of this policy. And Mr. Witkoff, special aide of President Trump, who took part in Alaska meeting and who regularly comes to Moscow to have the common understanding in terms of mutually acceptable peace settlement. We, as we all know, conveyed to Ukrainian side the assessments of the outcomes of the Alaska meeting, and as far as we got it, these assessments and considerations or proposals were rejected by Kiev regime, including those quotations which I have just made. And it's quite clear that both Europeans and Ukrainian regime are trying to convince President Trump to reject any idea of peaceful settlement and turns Biden's war into Trump's war. And it's quite obvious. This is the main concern for many European leaders, including in Paris, in Berlin, London, and Brussels. European and NATO Brussels stems from this perception. So, of course, they would like to undermine the peace process. There was a negative response and attitude to outcome of the Alaska meeting. They rushed to Washington trying to present their positions and using any possible tricks to prevent Trump's administration following the way of peace settlement, instead of the increase of sanctions, which is not decisive on the Russian economy, and pumping up the Zelensky regime with weapons, and by the forming sort of peacekeeping forces, but in fact occupation forces, creation of non-flying zone over Ukraine, and now they are just pondering the idea of shutting down the objects over the territory of Ukraine from the third-party territories, or just from Ukraine. And it reminds us, we had very famous satiric writers, Ilf and Petrov, and they just described in their books when people are gathering in public locations and start talking about policies of other countries, France and Britain, and it was a characterization as PK discussions, people who are not responsible for anything, but they are willing to talk about everything which they believe they are quite authoritative. Europe is clearly quite blatantly get seats in the negotiating table, but the positions of revanche or strategic defeat on Russia. They have nothing to do in this negotiation table. They are thinking about sending military contingencies to Ukraine, and we said that they would be regarded as a deliberate military targets, and they're trying to formulate something without our participation, and in contrast to creating military threats for Russia.
Just imagine Ukraine will become a territory where peacekeepers will be stationed, and for that part of Ukraine, former Ukraine, for that territory, they will provide Western security guarantees that will be targeted against the Russian Federation. What will it mean? It will mean the only one thing, that the West has occupied Ukraine, and if there are no legislative changes in Ukraine, it means that in this territory occupied by the West, the Western armed units will protect the neo-Nazi regime, and the laws will be put in place that will ban the Russian language in all spheres of life, and that will ban the canonical Orthodox Church. That's what the West is protecting, and that's what they're working towards. We'll do our best to provide security guarantees. We have been doing that in February 2014, and a year later, when the Minsk Agreements were approved by the UN Security Council, security guarantees must be put in line with the commitments of the West that are enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, and as well as in the documents that were adopted by the OSCE at their summits in Istanbul 1999 and in Astana in 2010. These security guarantees, as it was agreed earlier, they should be based on the principle of indivisible security, and the principle according to which no country has a right to strengthen its security at the expense of the security of others. That's what the West has been doing, trying to save Ukraine from its total collapse. Probably my statement was quite long with making all these preliminary remarks, but I still want to have some time for interactive dialogue. I kindly ask the moderator. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lavrov. We would like to thank mass media for participating in the roundtable. We thank representatives of the mass media and kindly ask them to leave the room.